Welcome everyone to the third installment of Ohio Environmental Council's Advocacy Training Series, Advocacy in Your Backyard, How to Make a Difference in Your Community. There are tons of ways cities and counties can take action to protect our environments, and getting involved right in your backyard can be a good way to help spur action. We are really grateful to talk with two great panelists today related to getting involved in community advocacy at the local level. I'm excited to introduce them in just a second, but do want to note that if you're interested in supporting this work and supporting OEC, we ask that you make a donation. We'll drop that link in the chat for folks. But without any further ado, let's talk local action. I'm pleased to welcome Columbus City Council person and President Pro Tem Elizabeth Brown. And later in the conversation, we'll welcome Callia Tellez, OEC Environmental Policy Fellow. And so Callia, we'll see you in just a bit. So Councilmember Brown, we're so excited that you're joining us here today. You were elected to Columbus City Council in 2015, re-elected in 2019, and have served on a number served in a number of different roles related to economic development, nonprofit service, and now in your elected position on council. And so as we're thinking about how folks can get engaged and involved in action for the environment, one of the best ways is to start at the local level. So can you talk a little bit about what drew you into your work as a city council member for the city of Columbus, and when did you make that decision to run for city council?
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here and really appreciate the invitation from OEC to have this conversation with you. So great first question. You know, honestly, I ran for Columbus City Council because I just love the work of local government. I think it's called local government, so it's right there in the title. It is very local to people. It is very personal. People can really see and feel the services that local governments provide. I really think at our best, elected officials are problem solvers, you know, sometimes at a grand scale, right? And even the president of the United States is a problem solver, right? That should be what he does in part. So in the largest sense, that's true, but also in very small ways, like we are here on Columbus City Council. And, you know, one just little story I have, it was like my maybe second month in office, and I was at a community meeting, and there was a woman who was probably 72, 73, and on the young end, she might have been older than that. And she was expressing to me how frustrated she was that she couldn't get the city to understand she didn't live in a multi-family home and that they should pick up her recycling. And I was like, okay, tell me more about that. So we have a threshold where if it's over a certain number of units in one building, it's up to the building owner to purchase the recycling service. And if it's below that, then the city does it for free. So anyway, she was like, I live in this right here, but I'm next to this other thing. And like, people don't understand that I am a sole homeowner and I should get my recycling picked up. And she was spot on. And she was 72, 73-year-old lady having to take her recycling, you know, pack it into her car and take it over to like the nearest rec center every week. And we made the right calls and were able to solve that problem for her. So that is a tiny little example, but one that I like to give of the power of local government, that you are really able to transform people's daily lives. And then of course, there are much bigger issues we work on, whether it's the role cities play in climate change, the role cities play in guarding public safety and providing affordable housing, all of these really big things. But I think a lot about this woman in my second month of office, who really taught me an important lesson of just listening, responding, and we changed her daily life.
Absolutely. I think that it sounds like an experience that was causing strife and stress for her, and helping solve that problem is so important. And I really like what you said there about listening to constituents. In terms of that moment that you decided to run, or maybe that first moment as you became a council member, what was that feeling like? And and what decisions were made in those first moments joining city council?
Well, it was an evolution to decide to run for office. I was always been interested in policy and in politics.
Mhm.
I was an AmeriCorps member doing city year between high school and college, and really fell in love with the work in classrooms. I was in a middle school and appreciating not just like the education policy that was set that affected what a teacher could accomplish every day, but also housing policy, wage policies. Kids walk into school with the whole lives happening outside those buildings. And that foundation that we lay through progressive public policies that actually level the playing field and allow all kids to get ahead was crystallized to me in that year I spent in AmeriCorps. And I think from that moment on, I really had a commitment to public policy, and I wasn't sure how I wanted to participate in what how I felt committed to that. But ultimately, through conversations with people I trust, and just starting to say out loud, hey, this might be something that I want to do, I realized it felt right, when I was talking about it that way. And then I had an experience where I was advocating for paid family leave for City of Columbus employees, and I kind of didn't get very far with my advocacy. And I was like, well, this is screwed up. If I ran for city council, I'd get to make this decision. And I have to say that kind of clicked a little bit for me. I ended up running that year. I was pregnant. And then when I got on Columbus City Council, ultimately passed a paid family leave policy. So I think it was like a mixture of a general interest and then like really kind of being pushed based on a few issues that felt, like catalysts for me.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those experiences. I always wonder when folks run for city office or for office in general, what's that spark? I would say that as someone who had thought about it for a moment, I think that I'm better suited to be on this advocacy side in the background and helping push. But we each have ways that we can engage in this work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. And one of the things I kind of left out that was probably part of your journey, I don't know, but so there's the interest in it, the recognition that it can make an impact, serving in office, that you can be a connector between advocacy and action and all of that. But there's also just like demystifying what it takes to do it. Like you getting involved in campaigns and understanding that it does seem a little intimidating to be that candidate, and it might not be the right thing for someone, right? Like you have to really, really love people, be willing to talk to anyone about whatever issue they have and dignify its importance and like, just sign right up to help. Like you have to be a kind of a weird kind of person. But if you are that person, and if what you're nervous about is the process of running, that's something that just participation, conversations, understanding what campaigns are about can kind of help you get there.
Absolutely. Oh, now like the thoughts wander too of like, what do you run for? And also I think it's a good plug too. So I have my, printed copy of our advocacy toolkit in terms of how folks can get involved too. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of our program, but there's ways in which we help instruct on how to contact your lawmaker at any level of government, and what does it look like to have a meeting with a lawmaker about an issue that you care about. What are ways that you can amplify some of those calls to action? So I'm gonna come back to a question about environment and city council and work there, but on the topic of hearing from constituents and hearing about those issues that matter most, how do you gather feedback from city residents?
Well, there are no shortage of ways to hear from people in this day and age. People will volunteer their opinions on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, everywhere. And so I do think there is kind of a feedback loop that it's just inherent in these kinds of jobs now. So one of the really important things that I remind myself is that, mostly the world exists outside of Twitter. And there are certain really types of people who have the ability to be engaged in that way, right? And there are other kinds of people who aren't engaged that way and focus their engagement in other ways. And so when we think about gathering feedback, we think about doing so deliberately, doing so through diverse channels. So in person, on the web, through social, through meetups, sometimes through organizations that represent a membership of people who may never feel comfortable talking to their elected official about an issue. We've in particular thought a lot during during COVID-19 about a program we began called Right to Recover, which helped people basically recover lost wages when diagnosed and needing to quarantine due to a positive diagnosis of COVID-19. And we thought a lot particularly about undocumented people because they're so often cut off from having any kind of government support due to federal law. But we also recognize a lot of undocumented people don't want to sign up to talk to an elected official because that's intimidating, and they start to wonder about how their status might be exposed or targeted or et cetera. And so we then went to organizational leadership that represented folks who may not be comfortable with those conversations. So when we gather feedback, we think principally about those multifaceted channels, and then who are the people that are just never going to raise their hand, and how do we reach them anyway? Because they're usually the most marginalized and kind of the most in need of our responsiveness.
And I think that's thank you for that. I think that that's really helpful to understand the ways in which people can reach you to share that feedback. And that last point, I think, underscores, when it comes to climate change, our most marginalized communities, our Black and Brown communities, are normally the most impacted by the harsh effects of climate change. And so I think that's my pivot point into environmental issues that city governments, that local governments can work on. And so can you talk a little bit about your work related to environmental issues and climate change issues in Columbus?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that climate change is a really good example of what I was talking about in the beginning, how policymakers really, we should be kind of at our core dedicated to problem solving. And it doesn't matter what level of government that we're serving at. That there are really big policy issues related to climate change that we rely on world leaders, right? National leaders, state leaders. But there is so much on the local level too that we can aggressively pursue. And the IPCC report really called this out to say, cities, you have a role here too. And I think they meant in part, cities as in large employers in cities, and not just city governments, but city governments too. And so we at the City of Columbus, we have a few really good things happening right now to help control our impact on climate change, to help build a healthier climate future for the next generation, and really to just recognize what cities can do to contribute to this conversation and action. So one of the things I want to call out is our urban forestry master plan, which is an overall plan put forth by our Recreation and Parks Department to increase Columbus's tree canopy to 40%. We right now are on the really low end of tree canopy among cities. We're in those low 20s. And tree canopy is, of course, something that makes our neighborhoods and our streets and our green spaces more beautiful. But it actually has a really important climate effect too. And it really has, there is an equity issue to how trees are dispersed in cities across the country. And that's no different here in Columbus. So if you look at neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color, here in Columbus, predominantly Black, neighborhoods that were victim to redlining. Those are the same neighborhoods where tree canopy has been largely destroyed. And then you look at predominantly white neighborhoods like Clintonville, where they enjoy a really healthy tree canopy. And that tree canopy, yes, again, more beautiful to look at and does affect the climate, but it really has an impact on people every day as well. Real quality of life issues. Tree canopy mitigates urban heat island effect. It helps with, wind cover in the cold months. Helps really even out utility bills. Again, in cold months and in warm months. And it's an important quality of life factor, as well as climate change factor in so many ways. And so I'm really excited by us finally naming this goal and putting a plan together to get there. And it's by no means going to be easy, especially as Columbus is growing and has a ton of development pressures too. And we can't pretend that that's not part of the equation. We have to be able to both improve our environment and pursue economic growth at the same time. There's a way to do it, and we have to, really focus on doing both. Additionally, we have a roadmap to meet our community-wide 2050 carbon neutrality goal, our Columbus Climate Action Plan. We also, Clean Energy Columbus, our community choice aggregation program, which we have a goal to implement a program that provides 100% clean and renewable energy by 2022 through community choice aggregation. The city will contract to provide residents and small businesses competitively priced and clean electricity from retail generation supplier certified by the PUCO, by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. We're very excited that people of Columbus voted on that to implement community choice aggregation. And it is a really good thing for our residents and a really good thing for our climate. And then additionally, we do have a program longstanding called Green Spot Columbus. It is really a resident-driven, community-based program that promotes and supports individual households and businesses and community groups to adopt sustainable practices. And I want to call this out because I think there is a real recognition in the climate community that achieving a healthier climate, mitigating the impacts of climate change, doing better by the next generation, that requires big actions. It requires international dedication and international leaders, world leaders, to really try to steer the Titanic differently. Absolutely. It requires big things by policymakers. And yet, I do think that it helps when individuals want to advocate and promote better climate forward policies, to also find ways in their individual lives to be able to do more. And that's what Green Spot is. It's not single-handedly going to change the direction it's not single-handedly going to, end climate change issues, but it does give people ways, and especially I have kids, I have 3 kids under 6, and I think about how to teach them about a healthier climate and love of nature and love of our natural environment. And one of the ways we do that is by giving them little things they can do, like recycling, like turning the lights off when you leave a room, turning the water off while they brush their teeth. Again, I'm fully aware of the limitations of little actions like that. But this is how we teach lessons, I think parents, if you're listening, you can kind of relate to that. And so I've gone on a bit about Green Spot, but look it up because it is just a nice way to personally dedicate yourself to more sustainable practices.
That's fantastic. And I think that for me, that sparks a reminder that, one of the ways that I first got involved in environmental issues was attending a city council meeting as a kid. Because they were taking down trees on the street that I grew up on, and I was really upset about it. And it sparked kind of a love of environment, a love of how to get involved in a political way to influence policy and things like that. And so you can never start, I think, too early or too small on some of these actions to really inspire the next generation who is inheriting so much of, so much of the environment that we are trying to protect today.
That's really beautiful. And it reminds me, I was just listening to like a parenting podcast about climate and instilling that in your kids. And similar to your experience, what they said is falling in love with the environment is the best way to establish a lifelong commitment to these issues, right? Like you loved those trees and you weren't, that's what sort of brought you into advocacy, because you had that relationship with your natural environment. And if you first tell kids like the world is falling apart, then they're going to approach the conversation with a ton of trepidation. But if you show them how beautiful the world is and then introduce the concept of protecting it, that's the kind of lifelong commitment that I think we need in the next generation.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to what we'll talk a little bit about later too, and talking from that lived experience and telling those stories when you're interacting with your local elected officials or with your lawmakers. Telling those stories of what's actually happening on the ground is really important to illuminate some of those issues that are impacting our neighborhoods. I'm joining you from Cleveland, and we similarly have a climate action plan and a reforesting plan here in what was once known as the Forest City. And there are different ways that you can share those stories and work with different coalitions on some of this work too. And so I'm going to invite anyone who has questions to drop those in the chat. But I think that my next question for you, Councilmember Brown, is in terms of where to push. Is it always contacting your elected official, or are there other opportunities that you see for folks to raise concerns, to share their stories about some of those environmental challenges that they might be facing, and trying to influence policy, influence master plans, things of that nature?
I mean, I think it's kind of both, and you direct outreach to elected officials is awesome, and I always encourage people to get on the government website of whatever level you're looking at and find the information to email directly an elected official or their office. You could call directly, etc. I think that's really important. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on an Ohio Environmental Council event, but I really think that outreach to groups like OEC is really important, because this goes for climate, or any other issue, protecting a woman's right to choose, climate, affordable housing, any of these things. There is a strategy to advocacy. There is a strategy to policy movement. And so working as an advocate with an advocacy organization helps amplify what you do, right? It helps you plug in to tell your story. First of all, maybe to tell your story in the most meaningful way, because advocacy organizations kind of understand how to help you do that. But then also, if you're really committed to a general issue, but you don't know what needs to be like pushed over the edge in this moment, advocacy organizations can help orient you to that. And I think recently about our urban forestry master plan, and that we had a series of community meetings set up as we were designing it. And then the same thing with our climate action plan. They happened at different times, but they were the same kind of community process. And then at the end, it came to council to kind of adopt. And there were a few things that advocacy organizations really wanted to move the needle on. And so if you are a community member and you're just writing city council and saying, hey, I really care about trees, you may not be narrowing in on where that opportunity, like where the delta could come, and so advocacy organizations help us channel that. And I would really encourage residents to kind of take a both and approach. And if you have to choose, go through advocacy organizations, because it really is such an important part of the democratic small d process.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. In terms of the environmental issues that you're tracking as we look towards the future, I would ask kind of what are you tracking, and how are you tracking that? How are you staying informed about the environmental issues impacting residents in Columbus, or for those who are joining us from outside of Columbus, how should other elected officials stay in tune with their residents?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot about trees. I really think a lot about trees, in part because I am the chair of our Recreation and Parks Committee on City Council. So the Urban Forestry Master Plan is kind of in my committee. I don't run the department, that's all administrative, but I'm in charge of, for example, our capital budget is underway, and I'm in charge of fighting for the funding they need to execute on this upcoming year's plan. And then every year after that, that's something I am excited to champion. So I do really think about that. And I think about how this big goal actually works for real people. And so I really get my news on that front, just talking to the practitioners. I'm lucky in that way, that I have regular check-ins with our rec and park staff, and I can understand how, street trees in some neighborhoods, while they may have, low tree canopy and may, quote, need those street trees, could be viewed as kind of a nuisance, right? If you don't feel the trust that your city is going to maintain that tree in the tree lawn, if there are issues with leaves falling, or if you're skeptical that the roots won't impact the sidewalk and you already have broken sidewalks in your neighborhood, there's real practical things that occur alongside these big plans we all like to say we have. So I'm really focused on that, and look forward to kind of following it in that way. And I think a lot about energy generation too, and how that impacts climate change. So that's a separate issue from the Urban Forestry Master Plan. And I'm looking a lot and trying to understand solar, and how we can do better as a city, how I can do better as an individual in encouraging solar energy generation, and really the as we're like, I don't have a hybrid car, but my sister just got a Chevy Volt, which I know they don't make anymore, but like, it's really exciting to think about some of these tools that may be more commonplace again when my kids are older. But then if we're going to move towards electricity, then how are we making sure that we're greening the electric grid? And so those kinds of big questions, I'm going to be closely following as well, to understand my contribution as a policymaker.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate those. And I think the last question that I have for you is, so you're tracking these issues. How best would you recommend residents in Columbus, residents across the state, track issues in their local community? We have so many communities that do things in different ways, but if you had some top tips, what would those be for tracking legislation, tracking budgets, things of that nature? Do you have any tips and tricks that you would share?
I mean, it's so hard, honestly. And yes, I'll try to nail down some tips here, but I do think it's hard because climate change and environmental health is like everything. I mean, we didn't even touch on lead, right? And lead in water, clean water in general, lead in water. I just learned that some rubberized playground equipment can have lead, through like obsessive mom Googling, because my kid bit a swing. Actually bit a swing. She gnawed on a swing for like a solid 10 minutes before I saw it. I was like, is it poison? And so anyway, there are so many things to get engaged in, and environmental health covers so many areas. And so I guess my main piece of advice would be to think about, if you're interested in climate change, if you're interested in the environment, environmental health, to really think about where your passion lies in making that push for change, because you can't do everything. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people, and we can pull from a big movement, and other people can take up portions that you personally can't. Think about what you have the time for and the ways that you can contribute. If it's lead in water, if it's fighting for clean water, and I know particularly, I mean, Emily, you said you're in Cleveland. This is a big deal. Lead exposure in children is tragically high in Cleveland. Yeah. And so, if you're listening from Cleveland, take that up. I think there's infrastructure money in the Build Back Better plan moving through the federal government right now to help fight things like this. So sign up for OEC's email list. Honestly, I get great digests and news alerts from OEC. And that's one way to help, muddle your way through this. Follow the news and find your passion area and try to find those advocacy organizations that intersect with it. And they can be your kind of advocacy for dummies kind of channels for this. Because the news can be big and overwhelming and really multi-channeled.
Absolutely, thank you for that, and thanks for the plug too. We are tracking issues at the State House, on Capitol Hill, and in city halls across the state, and so including Columbus City Hall. So thank you so much, Councilmember Brown. We really appreciate you sharing your insight with us today, and really appreciate all of your advocacy for strong environmental policy. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Callia Tellez is our OEC Environmental Policy Fellow, and she is joining us next to talk about, so we just talked about kind of work at the local level and how we can advocate at our city halls and municipal governments across the state. But Callia and I recently have been working on some issues that we're talking about local issues and bringing those to the state house level. And we're specifically talking about some of the redistricting work that we've been doing. And so Talia, welcome to our program today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on? And we'll jump into some of our questions on your inspiration for advocacy work right after this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm the policy fellow. I joined here at the OEC in April and pretty immediately went straight into our redistricting fight. And that has led me all over the state. And as Emily said, into the State House, but most importantly, I've been going with community members, some of which have, are seasoned advocates who testify at their city council meetings and have testified at the State House before, but a lot of people were new and had never engaged with the side of policy or politics before. And so it was really wonderful connecting with all types of advocates across the state through redistricting. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I too have heard from some of the local advocates here in Cleveland on some of these issues and talking about what's happening in their backyard and why some of our state house policies are really important in helping address those issues. So Callia, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to get involved in advocacy work and advocating at the local, state and national levels.
Absolutely. I think a lot of that inspiration comes from my family. So the first advocate I knew was my father. He was a family practice physician in downtown Dayton in a clinic. And as many of you know, Dayton is an epicenter of the opioid crisis. So I grew up with lots of conversations around the dinner table about access to food, healthcare, jobs. And my father was an immigrant from Central America. And because of that, he taught me to be very aware of the privilege of education. So I did want to honor that, honor the privilege my father had given me, and also become an advocate. I grew up with a deep connection to the environment, but the environment is so interconnected with social determinants of health in so many ways. So it's not that different from healthcare advocacy.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that we heard some of that from Councilmember Brown too, in terms of these environmental determinants of health, like you mentioned, that it's so much of our work and it's so interconnected. And so how have you been organizing communities to get involved in the redistricting process or in other work to talk through some of these interconnected issues?
Yeah. And first, I want to acknowledge it seems pretty odd for an environmental organization to be so involved in redistricting. And this was a really interesting way to engage everyday Ohioans to make personal connections between policy like gerrymandering, like fair maps and environmental justice. So most Ohioans, including myself, for a long time, learn about gerrymandering in school, know it's bad. Perhaps you've seen pictures of Snake on the Lake district or the Duck district, and have a basic understanding of partisan effects of gerrymandering, but don't really understand, one, what gerrymandering has to do with the environment, and two, how that affects my community personally. So what we did over the past few months was we gathered Ohioans to draw their community using an online mapping tool, and people started to learn from each other in these sessions. This community has 4 grocery stores and a main street with doctor's offices and a bike path to go to work, and a stone's throw away, here's my community, and it's a food desert, and it has houses that haven't been treated for lead paint. And this is the community where they put the highway through. And, we start asking ourselves together, why is this the case? Why has nothing been done about this? Why does the splitting, cracking, packing of these communities change the ability for us Ohioans to advocate for our health and safety?
Thanks for laying that out, right? In terms of, a healthy environment requires a healthy democracy. We say it all the time, but those are some real examples of why that is the case. And so in your advocacy work, can you talk a little bit about what are the tools and strategies that you've found most effective in delivering some of these messages, especially, again, kind of connecting that local experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the greatest tools is any visual, anything, especially in this day where, testimony is over Zoom, or we have very few in-person meetings, and a lot of things is on social media these days, which, as we'll talk about, is a great tool. But I think the power of visualizing what is happening, what your narrative is, to match what's happening in your community. Because as someone who has spent the past few months looking at maps, asking people to draw maps, visual spatial data is only one aspect of it. And lawmakers really need to hear that personal narrative. So a tool that we used that was really helpful was this mapping tool called District R. There's another tool in particular that I use for testifying to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. It's called EJ Screen. Emily has heard me talk about EJ Screen so much because I think it's just fantastic. It shows where low-income communities of color are experiencing environmental hazards, such as high cancer risk, Superfund site proximity. And I overlaid that with district lines, and you can see so clearly, here's a predominantly low-income Black community close to industrial corridor that is exposed to toxic water. And instead of being in a district with similar communities, it's cracked in half and diluted way out into a district with affluent white communities that just don't have the same lived experiences. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. When a citizen can point on a map and offer their lived experience as narrative, that makes it extremely compelling. But in situations where you can't have visuals, again, just that personal connection, that personal story, I feel, is such a powerful tool in advocating for yourself.
Absolutely. I think that there's, in talking through the different ways in which we can advocate, again, I will point to our advocacy toolkit that you can find online, and we're happy to share out copies as well. We talk about, if you're able to sit down with a lawmaker or a local elected official, if you're able to call a local elected official, if you're able to testify in front of a city council, in front of a state redistricting commission, there are tips and tricks on how to do that, and we talk about that too, right? Combining that personal narrative, talking about some of the data points, and really sharing that out. I was really excited to hear from Councilmember Brown about the ways in which they're soliciting feedback in multiple ways, which I think brings us to our next question, that oftentimes the communities that need to be heard the most have the least access to elected leaders, to media, to policy and legal advocates. And Callia, I'm interested, can you tell us about how injustice and advocacy relate, and what can we do to make sure that all voices are heard in this movement for a healthier environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So low-income Black, Indigenous communities of color are the most likely to face environmental hazards. Be on the front line and fence line communities to pollution and climate change. This is the basis of environmental justice. but using a lens of intersectionality, which is a term concept coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Using intersectionality, we can look at multiple identities and how those stack against systemic oppression. So low-income communities of color not only have disproportionate exposure to pollutants, but they are most often the targets of voter suppression efforts and policing that make it more difficult to do the thing that a lot of us take for granted, to go downtown to protest, to go knock doors in a white neighborhood for a ballot initiative. These are things that we must consider in our advocacy work, whether you are a professional policy expert or lobbyist, or if you are just, have, let's say, I shouldn't say just, because every position, everyone's work is absolutely valued. But what I mean is if you have work outside of policy, it's a privilege to have these platforms that a lot of us have, to have contacts at the State House, to have contacts in media, for your next door neighbor to be a lawyer. But in reality, there is a whole separate world of organizing happening on the ground, outside of the organizations, outside of the media, and the onus is on the advocates with this privilege to be amplifying, funding, compensating the people doing the work on the ground with their communities. And I want to add to, we kind of touched on this, but Emily mentioned the different ways that community members can advocate, whether it's in person, whether it's letter writing. I will say lawmakers care more about hearing from you than they do from a professional organization in a lot of instances. As someone who has, been on the Hill and in the State House asking a senator to co-sign a piece of legislation, usually always they ask me, okay, where's the community support? If we get community members to sign postcards, to show up, to write letters, if we can see that this is something the community wants, then we'll consider it. So a lot of times your voice is a lot more important than someone with a position like mine. So you absolutely do have power. And again, depending on your identities, the way those identities intersect, you may have way less power to be heard by your lawmaker. So again, those of us with the power, with the privilege to be heard with the platform, need to make sure that we are amplifying the voices of those who do not.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that candid conversation on the use of power and privilege to advocate here. It's really, really important. And so I think that speaking of one of those powerful media to advocate, let's talk just a little bit about the media and how can we use traditional media like op-eds, letters to the editor, to raise voices and to amplify voices in community. How can we use social media and digital media to do that as well? How can we use media to shape how people can get involved in these advocacy efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with op-eds or advocacy in printed news media, one thing that I like to do is take a critical eye at whose voices are being heard, whose op-eds are usually being published. What perspective are these coming from? Is it mostly coming from field experts, or is it coming from those with lived experiences in communities advocating for themselves? Now, luckily, in this day and age with social media, it makes it so much easier for us to amplify what others are saying than before. Like, it's as simple as a retweet or a tweet. And, just having that critical eye of looking to see whose voices are brought to the table in a lot of the policy issues that we get invested in. So, even if you don't choose to get involved through writing or through calling up a lawmaker or organizing, you can keep sharing the work that others are doing on social media, with emails with your friends or family members or communities. Share the work that is being done by Black, Indigenous, people of color advocates, by the communities who are most affected by healthcare, education, environmental policy, so that those are the narratives that we are informed by. Because you may care about an issue. Maybe your friends on Facebook or your friends on Twitter aren't aware of this issue, and they should be educated by those who have a lived experience in that issue.
100%. Listening intently and authentically to communities. I would invite anyone to drop a question in the chat if you have any of those, or in our Q&A section. Callia, I think the last question that I have is related. Let's circle back on this environmental justice theme that has kind of been the thread that we've talked through here. Let's talk about environmental injustice at the community level as we're talking about kind of advocacy in our backyards. Environmental injustice is often can be seen most clearly at the community level. And when we're talking through advocacy pieces, we want to lift up those stories. Can you just provide some examples of how environmental injustice impacts communities across Ohio, for those who might not know, who are joining us today, so that we're talking about the next actions that we can take together.
Yeah. Thank you for making space for this conversation in general, these questions. I think it's really helpful to talk through these concrete examples. So environmental injustice, it's seen not only in the communities that face disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards, like contamination, lead lines, toxic air from nearby industrial facilities, but it's also seen in the communities that don't have access to green space, grocery stores, reliable transportation. Our environment is so much more than the green stuff that we care about. And while that is extremely important, and it's also a health asset to all of us, I like to think of your environment as also just what's in your immediate surrounding. You know, our bodies are also part of our environment, our health, our well-being, our mental health. So environmental justice is so much more than exposure to the environmental elements. You know, it is also the impacts of systemic racism and oppression that keep communities powerless to advocate for their right to clean air and water.
Thank you for that. Closing us out with a final question. What have you found to be the most effective tool that you've used in your advocacy? And can you talk a little bit about that experience for us?
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question. Yeah, you know, again, not to keep harping on the power of mapping tools, but as, you know, a total mapping nerd, I took some GIS classes when I was an undergrad. That was a really impactful tool for me to use in my testimony to the Redistricting Commission on gerrymandering, because you know, you can talk all day about what environmental justice is, and how we must center these conversations on low-income communities of color, but being able to put on a map and just see for yourself so clearly, you know, the colors of the map showing that the low-income Black communities of Cincinnati and Dayton, Cleveland, Columbus truly are facing the most hazards of all these environmental indicators. You know, to see that and to put it in the context of where you live too, you know, perhaps you see that in a community where your family members live or where you grow up, or perhaps in a community that faces an entirely different lived experience. To be able to, as we just said in the last question, contextualize environmental injustice to your community, to the community you care about. And I think that's a powerful tool for lawmakers too, you know, to hold that up and say, this is your district and this is what's happening to half the people in your district and you're not listening to them. You know, to see the evidence, I think is extremely powerful. And again, you know, that my words to the Redistricting Commission were, of course, informed by those that I had been engaging with, you know, wanting to amplify what is their experience in these communities. So again, that narrative piece is extremely important. But yeah, thank you again for asking that question.
Absolutely. I think that for me, coming from a communications background, I'm always um, I'm always interested in the power of a letter to the editor or an op-ed writing to share some of these experiences even wider. And so I think for me, that's one of the tools and strategies that I tend to look at and observe and see what works best. And we have some of those tips and tricks in our advocacy toolkit. We're running out of time, but we do have one last question that I think is a good note for us to end on. Callia, you can share, I'll share and close this out. What's your favorite part of doing advocacy work? This is hard work with a lot of details that we need to check in on. So what's your favorite part of this? Because I think it's there is joy in this work as well.
There is. And a lot of it comes with connecting with people who are also passionate about things you're passionate about the things that you've never heard about, and you love to just see your coworker or your friend light up talking about, why do you come to work every day? Because everyone in advocacy work deeply cares. And yes, that means that we deeply get affected by the trauma that is associated with our work, but we're also deeply affected by the passion, by the joy. And just like there are endless interconnections with environmental justice and environmentalism in terms of social healthcare, all those things we touched on, there's also that for our passions. Everyone has a unique reason why they're in this work, and unique intersections of their lives that they meet every day when they come to this job. But yeah, I love just connecting with others.
That is part of my favorite part of this work too, is connecting with passionate advocates. And I think knowing that there's so many issues that require our advocacy, unfortunately, but fortunately we have these really talented community advocates that are willing to continue to push at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level on things. And so, Callia, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate Councilmember Brown joining us earlier on in the program, and all of the guests that have joined us for our advocacy training series. Again, we really appreciate everyone tuning in to these sessions. All of them are made available on our YouTube page, as well as our website, as well as our advocacy toolkit. You can find all of the tips and tricks that we've talked about over this 3-part series online and in our printed copy that we're happy to share with you. If you've appreciated this series, if you appreciate the work of the OEC and our work to secure healthy air, land, water, and a strong democracy for all who call Ohio home, we ask that you consider a donation to the organization. We'll drop that link in the chat for you, but also make sure to follow us. To Councilmember Brown's point, sign up for our e-newsletter and our newsletter, follow us on social media. We're happy to connect you with the environmental issues you care most about, and continue to share out our advocacy tips and tricks along the way. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. That's all for today, and we will see you next time.